So within the empire itself, it's always Austria. Austria controls around a third of the empire, and Austria going forward into the 19th century always has a much larger army than the Prussians do. It's only really in the sort of middle of the 19th century that military balance shifts, and the Austrians are, generally speaking, for most of the time into the mid 18th century at least, they are seen as the leading military power and the one that you copy. So a lot of the ideas come from the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs act as a kind of conduit as well, because they're fighting both the French mainly, and also they fight the Turks. They're experiencing two very different kinds of warfare, and so they are important for the kind of cross-fertilization. So the introduction of light cavalry tactics, light infantry tactics, a lot of that comes from fighting in Hungary, which is then transmitted through from men who've served there with the Habsburgs or deserters from Habsburg forces. And so forth. And then within the rest of the empire, we have the Swiss, who are a sort of autonomous confederation who gradually evolve out of the empire and are very important as a source of ordinary soldiers who are recruited into other European armies. The French, the Spanish, and so forth have large numbers of Swiss. And then we have the various German princes, of which there's probably about, I mean, we look at, you get these lists, they say, 250 or something. Really, there's only about 50 odd. And out of those, the ones that matter is about 15 or so that have some kind of military potential. Collectively, the rest have a potential, but only collectively. But the Habsburgs are the distinctive because they're the ones that can really act properly on an international level on their own. The others really are only able to do that as allies or auxiliaries of somebody else.
Yeah, and on Austria, I found that so fascinating because, we think of German militarism, and of course, modern Germany is what we think of, but Austria is really, for the last half century, they've had the largest military presence in the German speaking world, which, I guess, like we were talking about at the beginning of the show, it's all been shaped by World War One and World War Two. But I just, I didn't know much about Austria. Talk a little bit then about kind of what defined Austrian militarism, which is something that I don't hear too much about. Like, what is the? How does Austria? How do they differentiate themselves from the Swiss or the German states?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of shared culture within this area, and I think it's better actually to think of this as different types of military culture or martial culture rather than use the term militarism. Militarism tends to have this sort of pejorative sense of an excess and a way in which sort of the interests of the military are distorting the broader interests of society. And certainly, I'm not saying that didn't happen. Of course,
Yeah, it's a good point.
that happened many times. But I think if we only look at it from that perspective as a kind of critique, then we're not really always understanding what's going on. So what we get is a gradual development of once we have permanent armies. So this is something the Austrians, again, because they have the largest force, because they have this permanent threat from the Turks, they're the ones that create the first proper permanent units. So they've got 20,000, 30,000 troops that they can call on around 1600. The others, they only have a few hundred or so at the most, and then they rely on militia and men that they can recruit to form units when a war starts. So once you have permanent units, you then begin to get traditions building up, practices, and so on. And there are certain things that European armies have shared in common, and then there are others which are more distinctive. So by the time we get to the 19th century, we got distinct traditions in military music, distinct traditions in the way that officers and men interact, and so on. The Habsburg army was always a kind of multilingual, multicultural one. We tend to think of them as not being terribly efficient, but to be an officer in the Habsburg army, you normally had to speak at least one other language, so Hungarian or Italian or Croatian or Czech or all the other languages of the empire in order to talk to the soldiers. There was a separate kind of army German that developed as a kind of basic German that anyone from the empire could understand. So it has those kind of characteristics that come from its own general character as this sort of multinational, multi-ethnic empire.
Let's then mention Switzerland, famously neutral, but that wasn't always the case. What are kind of the defining characteristics when it comes to Switzerland?
Yeah, well, this is the thing, that this idea of the Swiss neutrality, and they must be very peaceful and so on. I mean, they fight numerous wars against each other and outsiders, and it's an aggressive power basically in the late 15th, early 16th century, and so they expand over the Alps southwards into Italy. So that's when the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland is essentially conquered and remains in an inferior status until the Napoleonic era, when they're given equal rights. There's various other bits that they conquered from the nobles that they basically kick out, and so these areas in Switzerland lack rights too. So it's a very hierarchical society, and it's very fractious as well.